Well, good evening to everyone. It is good to see everybody. I'm a mess. I don't have this on. I don't have a microphone on. And so turn your Bible over to Psalm 127 while I get all that going. Psalm 127. It is certainly good to see everyone. I'm thankful for the members here who have made the effort to come out. Thankful for the visitors tonight. We are grateful that you came all this way. As Dad also mentioned, thank you to the Overland brethren for coming. They've definitely heard this before, so appreciate y'all coming anyways. And you know, it's always a nerve-wracking thing to talk about parenting when your own parents are in the audience, but I think it's an important lesson. When we think about a healthy church, when we think about signs of a healthy church, I remember when I did an initial survey of just some different people that I knew, I asked them, well, what would to you be a sign of a healthy church? And several people came back and they said, well, a congregation that has several kids in it. And that's certainly true, much like this church that has young children in it. That's a sign that things are going somewhere and that there's other kids to grow up and other kids to kind of take the reins. But I'd put a caveat on that. A church with a bunch of kids that are growing in the Lord. Because we need to have parents who are disciplined. Parents who really understand what the purpose of being parents is. Why did God give me this blessing in the first place? And so in Psalm 127, we're going to just begin by reading in verse 1. Unless the Lord builds a house, its builder labor over it in vain, unless the Lord watches over a city. The watchman stays alert in vain. In vain you get up early and stay up late, working hard to have enough food. Yes, he gives sleep to the one he loves. Sons are indeed a heritage from the Lord, offspring a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior are the sons born in one's youth. Happy is the man who has his quiver filled with them. They will never be put to shame when they speak with their enemies at the city gate. This is a psalm actually from Solomon. We've only got a couple of those. If you've never noticed that, Solomon wrote this one. I think it's important for us to understand that children, whenever they're spoken about in the scriptures, they're always considered a gift from the Lord. Something that God gives as a blessing, a heritage, it says in verse 3, a reward in verse 3. In verse 4, he likens it to the arrows in the hand of a warrior. Those are needed. And hopefully you have several of those because it presents this wonderful idea that we're sending our children out into the world to be a force for good, like arrows that go out. And the man in verse 5 ought to be happy whenever God blesses him with children. What do you think about those four things? A gift, a reward, a blessing. What do you think? You know, our culture is actually attacking these truths. They don't look at a little child the same way that we do. They don't have the same lens. We see a baby, and much like it happened to Peyton on Sunday, you know, everyone just kind of comes around and just gawks at the baby. That doesn't happen in a lot of places. Children in many people's minds are a nuisance. Well, this has kind of happened. I'm not too happy about it. And the ones who are willing to go forward with the pregnancy, thankfully, they didn't take the child's life. But there's a lot of people that they say, well, I just don't want this child. I'm just going to abort the baby before it even comes to term. I just don't want this child. Our culture is attacking this notion that children are supposed to be a gift. And a lot of people are just annoyed by the thought of having children. But that ought not be the case in the Lord's church. Because you see, the very way we view our children will dictate how we parent. Because if I believe that this child, even when it's screaming and on my last nerve, is a gift from God, that's going to change how I respond. And so I think it's important for us to see that when we have children, this is really obeying the first commandment that God gave. You might be thinking, well, I thought the first commandment was not eat from that tree. You back up a little bit in Genesis 1 and verse 28, what did the Lord say? Go be fruitful and multiply. God always had the intentions for his creation to multiply and make more of themselves on the earth. What a cool thought. God always wanted his people to grow and to multiply. And so the third thing I want to say from the front end of this lesson is that we should gladly be spent for our children. The name of this lesson is What the Parents Owe the Children. I'm borrowing some language from the Apostle Paul here. In 2 Corinthians 12, Paul, in many of his writings, will liken his relationship with the churches as a parent and a child. You see him do it with the churches in Thessalonica. We see him do it here with the church in Corinth. Look what he says. He says, look, I'm ready to come to you this third time. I will not burden you since I am not seeking what is yours, but you. For children ought not save up for their parents, but parents for their children. I will most gladly spend and be spent for you. If I love you more, am I to be loved less? Three things stand out to me in regard to how we are supposed to feel about our children. Did you notice what Paul said there in verse 14? Since I am not seeking what is yours, but you. I don't want any of my kids' stuff. I doubt any of you do either, right? You go into your kid's playroom, and at least for the dads in here, you go in and you're like, when did we get this? I didn't even know we had all this stuff. There's nothing of my kids' stuff that I want. I'm not interested in it. What do you want? I want my kid. I want them. Paul is saying the same thing. I don't want you all, or I don't want your stuff. I want you. He said also in verse 14 that children ought not save up for their parents, but parents for their children. Parents are to care for the children when they're in their home. It's not the other way around. We don't rely on our kids to supply for us and provide for us. I mean, that's why I have a job, right? I'm not making my kids go out and make that month's mortgage or rent. This is just the natural order of things. I'm supposed to be supplying things for them, not the other way around. Paul also says, I will most gladly spend to be spent for you. You know, parenting is something we ought to be doing gladly and joyfully. Something I'm excited to be able to do because of how much we love them. So the question I want to ask this evening is, what are we spending for our children? But more specifically, what do I owe my kids? Like what is rightful to them? What is due them? You know, what's interesting is when you ask that question to the world, and even among churches, there's a lot of different answers to that. What do I owe my child? Well, some might say I owe them a good education and a big inheritance. That's at the very least what I could do for them, is give them the best education they can receive and leave them with as much money as I possibly can. Some would say I owe them some sort of possession. You know, I owe them a new phone so that they don't get made fun of at school. I owe them a new car whenever they turn 16. I'll buy it. They don't have to pay for it. I owe them video games. I owe them all these things. Maybe it's I owe them lessons. Maybe it's some kind of whatever discipline or sport they're in. They need all those extra things because all the coaches are saying they're going to be really, really good at this. Maybe I owe them, you know, some kind of extra instrument lesson because, again, they've been spotted as a prodigy of some kind. We get really caught up thinking this is what I owe them. If I want to give them like a right and proper childhood, then I gotta pay up. I gotta give it to them. But what do all those things have in common? They're all just physical. We convince ourselves that these things are essential, right? Like this is what's going to make my kid happy. This is what I owe them. And all the while, the scriptures don't say a thing about those things. I don't owe them any of that. What I owe them is my time. And I think most of you knew that this is where I was going with this. That's the most valuable piece of currency that we have. We're pulled in so many different directions. Time is just the greatest currency. And when we think about spending time with our children, I think the question that arises in conversations like this is, well, what kind of time should I be giving them? Is it the quality of time or is it the quantity of time? And I would say, yes, it's a little bit of both. Don't get too caught up on trying to figure out exactly which one is the right answer. I think the scriptures speak to both of these ideas. In Colossians 4, 5, and 6, Paul had written there, this is actually a memory verse at the congregation I'm a part of. We try to put an extra emphasis on evangelism all times of the year. And this is one of our favorite verses. Colossians 4, 5, and 6, I read from the Christian Standard Bible. It says, act wisely toward outsiders, making the most of the time. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you should respond and answer each person. Now, I recognize in evangelism context, we're talking about non-Christians, but we've got a lot of little non-Christians growing up in our house sometimes, right? Little heathens. And I've got to make the most of that time. God has entrusted me with hopefully 18 years that I'm going to be shaping and molding their mind. And so I don't know if it's a matter of like how much time I'm getting, but am I making the most of it? Every little moment that God is giving me with them, what am I saying to them? What am I doing with them? I think there are so many busy times in our lives and not as many down times as there ought to be. And so even when I do get to have a little bit of time with them, am I making the most of it? Am I making it a quality memory, a quality time? And I think we also in our culture need to redefine how we use the word quality time. It doesn't have to be just big and expensive. You know, I would imagine all of you have a really favorite memory with your mom or your dad from growing up. I want everybody to just take a second, and as I'm talking, just try to think about like a singular, we'll just pick your dad, for instance. What's a singular memory that you have with your father that you look back on and you're like, man, that was really good for me, and I didn't realize it in the moment. I'll share one with you all. You all know my dad. You might remember back in 2008, many of the brethren here do, because all of us were in construction here during the downturn. My dad's job moved, and he was working for ProBuild, selling windows, and then in the evenings, he would go install the windows he sold. And he was just working 14-hour days. And I remember I'd get home from school. Mom would encourage me to get my homework done. About the time I got my homework done, I'd scarf down some dinner, and Dad would come by the house, and he'd pick me and Doug up, and we'd go install those windows. That was several months on end like that. I wouldn't trade that for anything. He didn't buy anything for me, but it was just time together. You work it in when you can. And I would imagine the memories that you all have with your parents, they're similar. It's not some big vacation they took you on or whenever they bought you some big expensive item, but it was just some really helpful moment in your life where although they were busy, they showed you, I want to spend time with you. And I think that's the idea with our children as well. Again, there's a different context here, but in Psalm 90 and verse 12, teach us to number our days carefully so that we may develop wisdom in our hearts. Again, a specific context there. I just want to borrow the language because we understand that we need to number our days with our kids. We don't have them forever. Sometimes it feels like we will, but we really won't. And just a visual way to kind of say that. I mean, you think about a newborn child. This is every dot in this chart represents a week of their life. You know, they come out of the womb. You assume you get 18 years with them, 936 weeks. There's how exciting, right? Just week after week with this kid. And then they get to be 5 years old like mine is. And that's a shocking amount that's gone now. And then you get to an 11-year-old and it's halfway over. And then you get to a 16-year-old and it's like it's just going to fly by. What am I doing with these blue dots? Am I just existing? Just trying to create a space where they don't die until they're out of my home? Or am I making the most of the time? I'm trying to instill in them biblical truths that will give them success biblically later in life. Now, on that note, we want to talk about spiritual time with our kids. I love how squarely the New Testament puts this on fathers' shoulders. So if you're a father tonight, please listen up. In Ephesians 6 and verse 4, fathers, don't stir up anger in your children, but bring them up in the training and the instruction of the Lord. I really like that translation. Again, that's the CSB. Whatever time we do have with them, we better see our responsibility, fathers, to be spiritually shaping our kids. This is a commandment, not just a suggestion. What's really cool in Greek, in that verse, in verse 4, that word bring them up is actually the same word for nourish in chapter 5 and verse 29. And so when we think about the husband wanting to nourish the body, his wife is what it's talking about there. In a similar way, we're wanting to nourish our kids. Bring them up in, nourish them in the Lord. And how do we do that? Well, the text says you bring them up in training. You bring them up in discipline. You got to remember that this word training also means discipline. Now, there's two ways we can talk about the word discipline. There's the punishment aspect of discipline. We're going to talk about that here in a little bit. But then there's also the idea of like, an athlete disciplining their body. We're trying to help our kids become more disciplined, have more self-control. What spiritual regimen is your child on? Sometimes we're really good about getting them all these other regimens, right? Like if your kid really struggles to eat, we might go to a dietitian and they say, here's how many calories they need to be eating and they need to be this kind of food. And we put them on this kind of regimen. Or maybe if they're in sports, we let their coaches dictate, here's the kind of training regimen they need. Okay, well, fathers, we're the spiritual leaders. What's the spiritual regimen? What's the benchmarks for my kid? What am I going to do with them? Where am I trying to get them? Because they need some kind of spiritual training. And they're not just going to come by that naturally. And they're not certainly going to get it from school. They need to get it from a father who's spiritual. And they're certainly not going to get it if the only kind of spiritual encouragement we try to give them is when they come here. That's a start. But where the rubber really meets the road is what we're teaching them in our homes and at the dining room table. Now, he also says that you bring them up in training, but you also bring them up in instruction of the Lord. This word instruction, another way you could translate that is to call attention to. Because that's really what instruction is. Like when you go to college, they're instructing you and they're calling attention to particular things that you're going to encounter later in your career. When I went through the fire academy in Pennsylvania, it was the same way. My instructors called attention to, here are the signs of a backdraft. Like, just know if this is what's happening in the room, that means this next thing is going to happen. That's really what Paul is talking about here. Call attention to the things they need to be aware of. And there's really only one way we're going to be able to know what to call out. We got to be involved in their lives. If you want to know what the opposition is, you need to spend time with your kids. Like, it really is a lot like the quarterback in a football game. I mean, the quarterback who snaps the ball and he keeps his head down and he just looks until he's ready to throw it, he's not going to get anywhere. Because that quarterback, while he's doing that count and he's like trying to get the O-line or the defensive line to jump, what is he doing with his eyes? He's looking at the backfield. And he's trying to read, when this ball snaps, this guy is coming. And I got to call some audibles to get everybody ready for that. Parents, we got to be ready to call audibles. We got to get our heads out of our phone, and we got to get our eyes up at what's coming toward our kids. Just be an involved parent. Pay attention. And that can be so hard sometimes. Now, I want to talk about this word discipline a little bit more. Because as much as we owe them some instruction and some spiritual time, we do owe them discipline. Now, I'm going to give you a really helpful passage to consider when it comes to discipline. Look over at Hebrews chapter 12. Now, again, there's a context here. The context of Hebrews 12 is the writer describing to us that we ought to view what we go through when it's a hardship as discipline from the Lord, and we ought to recognize that that discipline means that God loves me. And that kind of makes us think differently through suffering, right? Whenever I realize, oh, I'm going through this because God's trying to shape me and make me better. But in the midst of that discussion, would you just read these verses with me and see what Paul said? Or excuse me, I don't believe it was Paul, but what the writer says. Look at Hebrews chapter 12. Start with me in verse 5. And you have forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons. My son, do not take the Lord's discipline lightly or lose heart when you are reproved by him. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves and punishes every son he receives. Endure suffering as discipline. God is dealing with you as sons. For what son is there that a father does not discipline? But if you were without discipline, which all receive, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. Furthermore, we had human fathers discipline us, and we respected them. Shouldn't we submit even more to the Father of spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short time based on what seemed good to them, but he does it for our benefit so that we can share his holiness. No discipline seems enjoyable at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. Pretty simple what I want to talk about here. If God is excellent and all perfect at disciplining, is it safe to say when it comes to my own kids, I want to discipline like God does? I want to strike this perfect balance that we see God able to do in Hebrews chapter 12. What kind of disciplinarian was God? Well, God was a God who loved his sons, loved his children, and that's why he disciplined them. The Hebrew writer is actually quoting from Proverbs chapter 3 that the Lord disciplines the one he loves, just as the Father disciplines the Son in whom he delights. And there are grave consequences for our kids if we do not discipline them the way that God does. There's 5 simple things to remember in the text. Number 1, God's discipline was coming from a place of love. Not hate, but love. We discipline our kids because we love them, not because we are angry with them. Because you see, that's how discipline is perceived by the world, especially when it's some kind of corporal punishment. When a spanking is administered, the world sees that as, I'm mad at my kids, so I'm going to hit them so that they understand that I'm mad. Okay, well, if that's what's happening in your heart, then yeah, you're doing this whole thing wrong. That's not the kind of discipline God does. God's discipline was very calculated and calm and understood. And that ought to be how we discipline our kids as well. We're not disciplining them because we're angry. We're disciplining them because they disobeyed. A rule was broken. It is systematic. It's not unchecked and emotional. It's something we look at and say, well, this is the consequence because you broke the clearly set forth rule. In Proverbs 13 and verse 24, he says, the one who will not use the rod hates his son, but the one who loves him disciplines him diligently. I think it's interesting that this proverb actually equates the lack of discipline with hate. It's strong language. But you get what he's saying. If you don't love your kid enough to discipline them and correct them, you are setting them up for failure later on down the road. It's supposed to be discipline that shapes them. Now, along with that, the way the text talks about discipline is that it is punishment. Discipline is supposed to hurt. That's the other side of the coin. There are varying degrees of punishment. We'll talk more about that in a second. But the point of a punishment is to help the child understand that there was a consequence for their lack of obedience or for whatever it is that they did. If the punishment is in no way worse than the thing that the child did, it's my suggestion that you're going to confuse the kid. Are we really punishing them whenever they've done something wrong and we say, go to your room, where all their video games are and where all their toys are? It's probably where they wanted to be anyways. And whenever I say to them, just go away, that's your punishment. What we're really showing them is that you've just annoyed me and I don't want you to be around me anymore. But instead, the approach that we're seeing is here's what you did. And here was the agreed upon punishment. And so that's what you're going to receive. You know, in Proverbs 23, it does say, don't withhold discipline from a youth. If you punish him with a rod, he will not die. Punish him with a rod, and you will rescue his life from Sheol. A spanking is not going to kill your kid. If you don't trust me on that, I stand before you as an alive person who most of you saw get spanked on the way out of this auditorium on multiple occasions. Right? It's not going to kill him. Be careful. Pay attention. And if your anger becomes a part of it, then you need to remove yourself from the situation. But this spanking that he's talking about is very biblical. Now, this godly discipline that he's talking about is also something that should result in respect. Did you see that down in verse 9? That godly discipline is supposed to make us respect the one who disciplines us. Now, as the authority figure in the home, the parents, that's what we're striving for. We want our children to respect us. And there are going to be two things that will drive them further and further away from respecting us, just like King David had happen to him, by the way. It said of King David about his son Adonijah, he kept exalting himself, saying, I will be king. He prepared chariots, cavalry, and 50 men to run ahead of him, but his father had never once infuriated him by asking, why did you do that? In addition, he was quite handsome and was born after Absalom. Adonijah had no respect for his father, and it was too late. There are severe consequences for children who grow up thinking that there is no consequences for their actions, and who think that they don't have to submit to authority and that they're above everything else. Our society and our culture is built around, if you don't submit to the rules of what we all have submitted to, we will control you. We have facilities, we have courts, we have places that we put people who will not yield to authority. It begins in the home, everybody. We have to submit to authority. We have to respect authority. But there's actually something else that is going to drive a child far, far away from respecting you, and that is severe and harsh punishment. That kind of outburst of anger and bullying your child. They're going to pick up on that as well. If this is you, you need to take some time before you discipline. In verse 10, the text had said about God's discipline that it was a short time based on what seemed good to them, but he does it for our benefit so that we can share in his holiness. Godly discipline is short-lived and it's case by case. If it's short-lived, what that means is that discipline is not for the entirety of the child's life. My dad has not spanked me in the last 2 days I've been here. I don't think he will. There's a pretty good chance he won't. There always is a chance he might. I don't think he will, though. But you get the point. We're not still spanking our kids. It was done for a short amount of time. It was short-lived. That's the way it works. And it's also something that ought to be case by case. I think it's important to take into consideration what the child has done when they disobey. There should be thought that goes into the discipline. So for instance, if there was rebellion versus neglect, I think there might need to be different punishments. A child who just forgot what the rule was, and you can clearly see that they're heartbroken, that they broke a rule that they forgot was there, maybe the punishment's going to be lighter, or maybe there's just going to be grace in a scenario like that. But my kid who knew the rule, and I saw them look me in the eye and break it anyways, it's a little bit of a different punishment. That's a part of them I want to make sure I break. That is not a good character to have. Some kids need a sharp look. A rebuke would suffice. Others taking a favorite toy, others a spanking. Each kid is different. And I would even suggest each time is different. And that is why we got to be so involved in our kids' lives to know exactly how to administer the right level of punishment. Fifthly, in this text, we see that godly discipline is supposed to yield something. In this case, the goal at the end of verse 10 was to share in God's holiness. And in verse 11, to yield the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. You got to remember that this is the point of discipline. It's to guide them where they need to go. We're trying to yield some fruit out of them. In Proverbs 22 and verse 15, he said, foolishness is bound to the heart of a youth. A rod of discipline will separate it from him. We're trying to separate behaviors whenever it comes to discipline, trying to get them to obey. Now, a very helpful principle a preacher laid out for Rebecca and I whenever we were pregnant with Sally. He talked about trying to control the child versus controlling the situation. I never heard it put this way before, and I found it very helpful. And he gave an analogy to explain what he meant. He told them about a time that he was driving down the road in their minivan. His wife wasn't with him, and he had 3 of his kids in the back. And one of his daughters, who was a very obedient child most of the time, all of a sudden decided she didn't want to be in her car seat anymore. And so at about 4 or 5 years old, she unbuckled herself and she got out of the car seat. And the oldest daughter said, Daddy, she's gotten out of the car seat. And my friend said it kind of threw him off. And so he pulled over and he said, get back in the car seat. And she said, no. Took him aback. So he got out. He administered some discipline. And he said, get in the car seat. She said, no. And after 4 or 5 times of this happening, she finally climbed up in the car seat, got her buckles back on, and they continued down the road. And my friend said, would it have been 100% in my capability to pick her up and shove her right into that car seat and buckle her up and tell her, do not unbuckle? Yeah, I could have done that, he said. But that would have been controlling the situation. I chose to take the time to control the child. And I got to tell you all, that principle has stuck with me throughout all of my parenting. That when we're involved, sometimes we make sacrifices for the sake of convenience. And I understand in some scenarios, that's what you have to do. But I would say the majority of them choose to control the child, not just the situation. In Proverbs 29 and verse 15, he said, a rod of correction imparts wisdom, but a youth left to himself is a disgrace to his mother. Again, this discipline is supposed to be imparting wisdom. I think it's important for us when our kids, after they've received some sort of discipline, that we have a follow-up conversation that says, I love you so much. What have we learned? And what can we do better next time? Show them how much you love them. Now, thirdly and lastly this morning, or this evening rather, we owe our children a kingdom-focused upbringing. Kind of to start this point off, we want to ask ourselves, what is my kid focused on? What is my kid focused on? Where's their head at? What are they thinking about? I think it's a good thing to ask. Like, do I have a kid that's head is just stuck in sports? I can't get his head out of that. Well, maybe it's time to sit him down and say, we're going to take a break this season. Because this isn't important, really. This is just a part of our life. It's not our life. My kid is really worried about looking cool. They're really worried about fitting in, and they're constantly trying to get the new phone and the new clothes. Maybe it's time to take social media away and have a conversation with them about who they should really be trying to compare themselves to. And of course, that's Jesus. Or you know what, my kid is just boy crazy or girl crazy. They're always talking about girls. They're always talking about boys. Maybe it's time to talk to them about it. Maybe talk through some of your own mistakes. Because you see, in the Lord's church, we don't just want good kids. We want kingdom kids. You know, I've had many conversations with brothers and sisters, and sometimes they will come to me and lament and say, Chase, I really have a good kid. He's a good boy. He's a good girl. But they just don't want to be at church. We don't want just good kids. We want people who are on fire for the Lord. And that's going to start with us. Are they kingdom-focused kids? And so what are some things that we can teach our kids to help them have this kingdom focus in their upbringing? Well, for starters, teach them to love and serve other people. I mean, isn't that what we're already supposed to be doing with one another? You might remember in Philippians chapter 2, we looked at verse 1 and 2 in last night's lesson. But in verse 3 and 4, Paul says that we ought not do anything out of selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility, consider others as more important than yourselves. Everyone should look not to his own interests, but rather to the interests of others. This isn't going to come naturally to a kid. It's hard for us as adults to practice this muscle of serving others and putting other people's needs ahead of my own. So what makes us think it's going to come naturally to a kid? Kids are naturally selfish. I want my thing and I want it now. It's going to take some intentionality to train that out of them. And so maybe on Saturday, when we really want to do this other thing, before we do it, we're going to go to sister or brother so-and-so's house and we're going to mow their lawn. Or we're going to check in on them and see if there's anything we can do. Because I need them to see that before we go do something that we really want to do, we're actually going to put the needs of the brethren ahead of even our own. How proactive would that be? Most kids are often focused on themselves. We can teach them to be focused on others by our own example. We ought to teach them honesty and integrity. This list could go on and on. Like, what do I teach my kids to have a kingdom focus? But in my estimation, this isn't important. I mean, you might remember that these are two of the things the Lord hates: a lying tongue and a false witness. Teach them to be honest. A bunch of liars out there. Liars even in the pews. Teach them to own up to things. Teach them to speak the truth even when it's not favorable for them. I think that's a tremendous asset for their existence, especially among God's people. That they can be a trustworthy person. That when certain information is revealed to them, they can be trusted to be quiet. They can be trusted that they'll be someone that's not going to go around gossiping, but they will keep it to themselves and quietly pray. And then lastly, teach them the fact that they need to be responsible and even care for themselves. I think this is a big part of what Paul is having to get after the church in Thessalonica for. So many lazy people. And I think that work ethic and the ability to provide for oneself begins when they're young. In 2 Thessalonians 3 and verse 10, we commanded you when we were with you, if anyone isn't willing to work, he should not eat. We hear that there are some among you who are idle. They're not busy, but busybodies. We command and exhort such people by the Lord Jesus to work quietly and provide for themselves. We are raising an increasingly and more increasingly generation that believes things should just be handed to them. Why is that? Is it because their parent, are enabling them with that? This is not God's work or God's way. God's way is for us to work. We got to teach them that. And so a principle I heard from an older brother at one time in general is that we should never do for a child what they can do for themselves. And so when a child begins to grow older and there is a sense of independence there, and they begin to say things like, you know, mommy and daddy, I would really rather pick out my own clothes and get myself dressed. We have the ability to step back and say, okay, you can do that. I'll allow you that freedom. Now, if you got something crazy on, then we'll talk. Might give some suggestions, but if you can get yourself dressed, I'm going to allow that to happen. And as they increase in age, those requests get bigger and bigger, and we begin to say, okay, that's fine. If you have your driver's license, then yeah, I'm going to let you borrow the car. I'm going to let you go out. I'm going to give you a little more responsibility because I trust you and I love you, and I know you can handle this. If it's something as simple as them being 5 or 6 and they can pick up their own room, then tell them to. Maybe I'll come behind and help. But you're going to go in and you're going to start, because I know you're capable of that, because you can work. We have such a work ethic problem on our hands, even among God's people. Teach them to be hard workers. And with this, ask yourself, what am I focused on? What am I focused on? The only way for them to have this kind of spiritual focus in the home is if I, the parent, have this kind of focus. What is your level of commitment to the Lord's kingdom? Is it superficial? Partial? And guess what your kids is going to be? You know, too often this is actually the other way around. The parents often just end up adopting the focus of the children. And so whatever it is my kid is really, really into, I'm just going to go all in on that. Maybe it should be the other way around. We invite our kids to be passionate about what we're passionate about. If I'm the father, then I'm going to be the father, not my child. If I'm the mother, I'm going to be the mom, not them. Don't be afraid of your kids. Be the parent, get in the driver's seat, and show them how to serve in God's kingdom. And let me tell you what I know many of you are thinking, because I feel it every time I do this lesson, is I feel overwhelmed. I feel like, man, I'm going to mess both of them up, and if we have any more, I'm going to mess those up too. Well, let me tell you something the older parents always come and say to me after a lesson like this, so I'm heading it off. Please leave room for God's grace. You're doing a good job. Keep trying. God's grace is sufficient. And for any mistake that I make with my kid, God's grace will make that up. He has shown that to us time in and time out. God's able to work through our imperfections, and thank God he does, because we have a lot of them. And he's able to work through the imperfections even in our children. So leave room for the grace of God. You all have been so kind and patient tonight. We have so many Christians in the audience tonight. If you want prayers to be a better parent, prayers in your life or anything, that's what this time is for. But we also like to offer up an invitation for anybody who's ready to become a child of God, to repent, believe in the Son, Jesus, and be baptized. So if you need any help in any way, come down to the front as we stand and as we sing. So marked by sin, he will be faithful. Your empty, wasted years, he will restore, and your iniquities remember no more. Bring him your every care, if great or small, whatever troubles you, oh, bring it all. Bring him the haunting fears, the nameless dread. Thy heart he will relieve, and lift up thy head. Blessed Savior of us all, almighty friend, his presence shall be ours unto the end. Without him life would be how dark, how drear, but with him morning breaks, and heaven is near.
Again, it's good to see a lot of young couples here in the audience that raising children, starting to raise some children, ready to raise children. You know, Chase brings up some large points here. Isn't our God amazing of the design of the family that he has? and the instructions that he's given us and how he's taught us to serve, how he taught us to serve one another, to serve him, the love, how he teaches us. And it's a cycle that goes on and on. First time I heard Chase's lesson, I sat and listened. We went over to Overland and he preached this lesson, and I thought, boy, I wished I would have spent more quality time, more time with my children. They're gone now, you know. They're out of the house, reminiscing, thinking back at those things. This time when I listened to it, I thought, the Lord wished I spent more time with him. So you older folks that are sitting there thinking this lesson didn't apply to you,